Mommy can't get up. She was nobody's threat, just a disgraced nurse in a borrowed blazer, answering phones for a man who made powerful people disappear. Nobody looked twice at Tony. That was their first mistake. The second was leaving her alone in that records room. Because Tony had spent 7 years reading medication charts in emergency rooms at 3 a.m., holding families together while everything collapsed around her. She knew exactly what a lethal dosage pattern looked like. And the file she wasn't supposed to find, the one misfiled behind 12 months of corporate silence, told her everything. She copied the evidence. She hid it somewhere no one would ever think to look. Then they found her. They broke her door. They broke her ribs. They left her bleeding on the kitchen floor of her Mapogu apartment while her 6-year-old daughter watched from behind the couch. What they didn't know was that Tony had dialed Eugene's private line before she went down. And when little Ella picked up that phone, sobbing, she said 4 words that rewired the most dangerous man in Seoul. Mommy can't get up. 3 days before Ella picked up that phone, Tony Brooks was doing what she always did at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, staying late, because leaving meant going home to an apartment that still didn't feel like one. She told herself it was about the filing backlog. The 43rd floor of Kang Group's Seoul Tower accumulated paperwork the way old buildings accumulated dust, quietly, relentlessly, in places nobody checked. Her job was to check them, so she checked. The records storage room at the end of the East Corridor had a light problem. The overhead fluorescent had been cycling in and out for 3 weeks, a slow, arrhythmic flicker that made the whole room feel like something from a fever dream. She'd submitted the maintenance request twice. Nobody had come. Tony pulled the bottom drawer of cabinet 7 and started sorting. She almost missed it. The folder was wedged spine first between 2 quarterly audit binders, flush against the back panel like it had been pushed there deliberately, or like someone had filed it in a hurry and hoped the drawer would swallow it whole. There was no label on the tab, just a faded patient number handwritten in blue ink. She almost moved past it, almost. But 7 years of nursing had trained her hands before her brain could argue, and she was already opening it. The name on the intake form stopped her cold. Kang Hyran, deceased. Eugene's mother. Tony knew the name the way everyone at the Kang Group knew it, reverently, carefully, the way you say the name of someone a dangerous man loved. She stood in the flickering light and told herself to put it back. Told herself it was none of her business. Told herself she had 3 months of rent to think about and a daughter who needed new shoes and a boss who didn't pay her enough to be curious. Then her eyes moved to the medication log, and her nurse's brain did what it always did, read the columns automatically, exactly, the way she used to read them standing at bedsides at 3 a.m. She reached day 7. She stopped. She went back and read it again, slower this time, with the particular stillness that only comes when your body already understands something your mind is refusing to accept. The numbers were wrong, not by accident, not by oversight. By design. And whoever had done this hadn't just killed Eugene's mother. They'd made sure the paper trail looked clean, almost clean enough that only someone who had spent years reading charts in the brutal fluorescent dark of an ICU would ever notice the difference. Tony's hands had stopped trembling by the time she reached the physician's notes. That frightened her more than the trembling would have. Because she recognized this feeling, this cold, clarifying focus that settled into her chest like concrete. She'd felt it exactly once before, the morning she'd walked into that licensing board knowing the hospital had already decided the outcome. She hadn't been wrong then. She wasn't wrong now. She closed the folder slowly, looked once at the door, and made a decision she didn't fully understand yet. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known standing in that flickering light with a dead woman's file pressed against her chest, was that somewhere on the same floor, behind a wall of smoked glass and brushed steel, a camera she had never noticed was already watching her. Serena Vaughn had a gift, not the kind people celebrated at dinner parties, though she was celebrated at many. Her gift was simpler and far more dangerous than charm or beauty or the particular intelligence that filled boardrooms with nervous energy whenever she walked in. Her gift was knowing exactly when someone had become a problem, before they knew it themselves. She was at her penthouse vanity in Hanamdong when the alert came through on her secondary tablet. The one that didn't exist on any corporate inventory. The one connected to a network of cameras installed in Kang Group's building 18 months ago by a contractor who had since relocated, quietly and permanently, to somewhere without an extradition agreement. She set down her earring and looked at the screen. The timestamp read 9:51. The fluorescent light in storage room 4E flickered across the face of a woman Serena had considered thoroughly inconsequential until approximately 40 seconds ago. The woman was holding a folder. Her head was down. She was reading with the focused stillness of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. Serena recognized that stillness. She'd seen it in lawyers, in auditors, in the one journalist who had come uncomfortably close 4 years ago before his editor had received a very persuasive call from a very senior advertiser. She picked up her phone, not the primary. The second one, the one with no registered SIM, the one she cycled every 6 weeks without exception. She made a single call, said 4 sentences, listened to the confirmation, ended it. Then she set the phone face down on the vanity, picked up her earring, and continued getting ready for dinner. This was the thing people never understood about Serena Vaughn. They looked at her, the architecture of her composure, the precise way she occupied every room she entered, and they mistook control for coldness. They were wrong. Serena felt everything. She simply categorized feelings the way a surgeon categorized complications: acknowledge, assess, eliminate. Sentiment was a resource drain. Empathy was a structural flaw. In the ecosystem, she had spent 20 years constructing around Eugene and his empire. Weakness was the only thing she genuinely could not afford. The secretary was a loose thread. Loose threads got cut. She had 4 days before the compliance calendar cleared and the wedding timeline locked. 4 days was more than enough. The crew she used didn't need more than one. What Serena hadn't calculated, what her camera hadn't captured, was whether Tony had already made a copy. And where, exactly, she might have hidden it. Tony didn't go home right away. She sat in the records room for 11 minutes after she made her decision, which was exactly how long it took her to stop feeling like a woman holding evidence and start feeling like a woman with a plan. There was a difference. The first one panicked. The second one moved. She used the floor copier at the end of the hall, the old one, the one that wasn't networked, the one that printed without logging to the central server, because it had been promising to update it for 2 years and hadn't. She copied every page of the medication log, every physician's note, the intake form with Kang Hairin's name on it. She added her own handwritten annotations in the margins, the kind of clinical shorthand that would mean nothing to a lawyer and everything to a forensic medical examiner. Then she folded the papers flat, rode the elevator down 39 floors with her face arranged into the specific blankness of someone who had stayed late and was simply tired, and walked to her car. She stopped at a convenience store on the way home, bought ramen and juice boxes and a roll of packing tape. The cashier didn't look up. Ella was asleep when she got in. 6 years old and utterly fearless in sleep, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed, her favorite book. The big hardcover one with the painted animals on the spine. The one she'd made Tony read aloud so many times that Tony could recite the first 8 pages from memory, sitting on the nightstand exactly where it always was. Tony stood in the doorway for a moment, just a moment. Then she took the book, went to the kitchen table, and spent the next 40 minutes carefully separating the back lining from the hardcover board, sliding the folded pages flat against the inner spine, and pressing the lining back down with the packing tape in 4 clean strips. When she was done, the book looked exactly as it always had. She put it back on Ella's nightstand, kissed her daughter's forehead, told herself she was being paranoid. She was in the kitchen making tea when she heard the door. Not a knock, not a key. The specific sound of a lock being defeated by someone who'd done it before, a brief resistance, and then nothing, the way a held breath releases. Tony reached the counter in 2 steps. She had a ceramic mug in her hand when the first man came through, and she put it across his face before he'd fully crossed the threshold. It bought her 4 seconds and a broken mug, and then there were hands on her, and she understood very clearly that there were 2 of them, and she was not going to win this. She fought anyway. She fought the way she'd survived everything else. Not gracefully, not strategically, but with the stubborn, furious precision of a woman who had a child asleep in the next room and absolutely nothing left to lose. It wasn't enough. She went down hard against the kitchen floor, her ribs screaming, one eye already swelling shut, and in the shrinking distance between consciousness and dark, she did the only thing left she could think to do. She reached for her phone. Eugene's private number, the one she'd been given for scheduling emergencies and had never once used, was the last thing her thumb found before everything went quiet. She didn't know if the call connected. She didn't know that it had. She didn't know that on the other end, 40 floors up in a tower blazing with Seoul's nighttime skyline, a phone was ringing on a desk beside a man who never answered unknown calls. She didn't know what would happen when a 6-year-old girl woke up to find her mother on the floor, spotted the still glowing phone screen in the dark, and picked it up. Ella had learned to sleep through noise the way children who move apartments too many times eventually do: traffic, thin walls, the neighbors upstairs. None of it touched her. But there were sounds she'd never learned to sleep through, sounds her body cataloged as wrong before her mind could name them, and the crash from the kitchen was one of them. She'd done what her mother had taught her, under the bed, quiet as a held breath. Don't come out until Mommy says your name. She waited. She counted the way Tony had shown her, the slow kind, the kind that was supposed to feel like heartbeats. She got to 47 before the apartment went completely silent, the kind of silent that felt different from safe. She waited longer. Then she heard her mother make a sound she had never heard from her before, something small and involuntary, the sound of a person losing a fight with staying conscious, and Ella stopped counting and came out. The kitchen light was still on. She saw her mother on the floor and understood, in the way that children understand catastrophic things, all at once and without softening. She didn't scream. She went to her knees beside Tony and put her hand against her face the way Tony always did when Ella was sick, checking, measuring. Tony's chest was moving. That was the only thing Ella allowed herself to feel good about. The phone was glowing on the tile 2 feet away. The call was still open, 43 seconds on the timer, the screen casting pale light across the floor. Ella picked it up with both hands. She didn't know whose number it was. She knew her mother had dialed it, which was enough. She pressed it to her ear. Hello. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Silence on the other end. Then breathing. Then a voice, low, careful, the kind of voice that was used to giving orders and had forgotten how to receive news. Who is this? Ella looked at her mother on the floor, looked at the door hanging open to the dark hallway outside, looked back at the phone. Mommy can't get up. 4 words. Eugene Kang had sat across from men who begged for their lives and felt nothing. He had made decisions in the space of a breath that other men agonized over for weeks. He had built an empire on the precise management of his own emotional temperature, controlled, calibrated, never cracked. 4 words from a 6-year-old, and something in his chest split clean open. He was already standing, already moving. His security chief, Min-soo, read the look on his face and was through the office door before Eugene had to say a single thing. They crossed the city in 11 minutes, which was faster than it should have been possible. Eugene didn't speak during the drive. He sat in the back seat with his jaw set and his hands still and something behind his eyes that Min-soo had worked for him for 9 years and had never once seen there before. They found Ella sitting on the kitchen floor beside her mother, the phone still in her lap, waiting with a patience that had no business existing in a 6-year-old child. She looked up when Eugene came through the door. She didn't flinch from him the way most adults did. She just said, "She's still breathing, I checked." Eugene crouched down to her level. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said very quietly, "I know, I've got her now." He meant it in the immediate sense, the medical team already en route, the car already waiting, Tony already being lifted with careful hands. But something in the way he said it landed differently, heavier, like a door closing on the version of this night where he hadn't answered. They were 20 minutes from the private facility when Min-soo pulled him aside and said they'd found something in the apartment. A child's storybook on the nightstand, its back cover slightly raised along one edge, the tape job clean but not invisible to someone who was looking. Eugene took the book, turned it over in his hands, looked through the window at Ella curled beside her mother in the back seat, asleep finally, one hand wrapped around Tony's fingers. He didn't open it yet, but the weight of it told him everything he needed to know about what kind of woman Tony Brooks actually was. What it didn't tell him was how far back the conspiracy went, or whose name he was going to find at the center of it when he finally did. Tony woke up on the second day. Not dramatically, no gasping, no disorientation, no movie-style return from the dark. She simply opened her eyes and found a ceiling that wasn't hers, white and clean and very still, and lay there for a moment taking inventory the way she'd been trained to. Ribs, 2 cracked, maybe 3. Eyes swollen but tracking. Hands, both present, both functional. The specific, practiced calm of a woman who had assessed enough damaged bodies to know how to assess her own. Then she heard Ella's voice in the corridor outside, and the calm cracked straight down the middle. A nurse she didn't recognize told her to stay still. She stayed still. When the door opened and Ella came through in clothes that weren't hers, clean, the right size, someone had gone and gotten them, Tony put her arms around her daughter and didn't say anything for a long time. Eugene was in the doorway. He didn't come in. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who had decided to give this moment its full space, which told Tony more about him than any file she'd ever sorted. He came back an hour later, alone. Ella was asleep in the chair beside the bed, the animal storybook open across her lap at the page with the painted elephants. She'd been carrying it since the apartment, had refused to put it down through the car ride and the intake process and the first frightening morning in a room that smelled like antiseptic and unfamiliar safety. Kids attached to objects when everything else went sideways. Tony knew that. She'd let her keep it. Eugene looked at the book, then at Tony. She wouldn't let anyone touch it, he said. No, Tony said, she wouldn't. A beat passed between them that contained several conversations. Neither of them was ready to have yet. Then Tony said carefully, the back cover along the left edge. He sat down. He took the book from beside Ella's sleeping hands with a gentleness that Tony clocked and filed away without comment. He turned it over, found the edge of the tape with his thumbnail and peeled it back in one slow, even motion. The folded papers came out first, her copies, her annotations, the medication log with its damning columns, and the handwriting that changed on day 6. Then something else came out, something Tony had not put there. A single envelope, thin and cream-colored, sealed and addressed in handwriting that made Eugene go completely still. She watched it happen, watched the color leave his face in a single, controlled withdrawal, the way light leaves a room when a cloud moves. She didn't ask, she waited. He opened it, read it in silence. The only movement in the room was Ella breathing, and the distant mechanical hum of the facility and Eugene's eyes moving across the page, with the awful focus of a man being handed something he had suspected for a long time and prayed he was wrong about. When he finished, he folded it once, set it on his knee, looked at the window for a long time. She knew, he said finally, not to Tony, not to anyone. She knew the whole time and she was trying to get the evidence out and she couldn't. He stopped, reset. The control came back across his face like a shutter closing, practiced and total. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, looked at Tony with something she couldn't quite categorize, not gratitude exactly, something older and more specific than that. You need to rest, he said. Both of you are safe here. Nothing comes in or out without my authorization. He picked up the letter and the copied files and walked to the door. 11 days, he said quietly, almost to himself. Tony frowned. For what? He paused in the doorway, without turning around. to build something she can't escape from. He left before she could ask the question that was already forming, the one about what exactly his mother's letter had said, and whose name had been written in it, and how long that name had been sleeping in the bed beside him. The most dangerous thing Eugene did in those 11 days was nothing. He went to the office. He answered emails. He sat across from Serena at dinner on Wednesday and Thursday and listened to her talk about floral arrangements and guest lists and the seating politics of tables 11 through 14, and he nodded in the right places and refilled her glass and gave her absolutely nothing to read in his face. He was warm enough that she didn't worry. He was distant enough that she assumed it was work. It was a performance calibrated to the millimeter, and he delivered it perfectly because he had spent his entire adult life learning that the most powerful position in any room was the one where you already knew the outcome. Serena had no idea she was already inside the trap. Minsu ran the operation from a secondary location, a floor of a building 3 blocks from Kang Group's tower that didn't appear on any corporate registry. The team was small, 7 people, each chosen for a specific function and told only what their function required. Compartmentalization wasn't paranoia in Eugene's world. It was architecture. They started with the medical associates. The medication log had 3 sets of initials across its 11 days, and 2 of them belonged to people who were still practicing. One was a pharmacist at a private hospital in Gangnam who had a secondary income stream that didn't appear on his tax filings. The other was a physician's assistant who had transferred institutions 4 times in 6 years, always quietly, always with a reference letter from the same senior administrator. Minsu's team found the pharmacist first. It didn't take long to flip him. It rarely did when a person's livelihood, freedom, and carefully constructed second life were laid out in front of them in a single manila folder. He gave them 3 encrypted communication chains and the name of the administrator who'd coordinated the handwriting substitution on day 6. The administrator gave them something better, a pharmacy receipt trail that connected directly to a procurement account registered to a shell company that, after 4 layers of corporate separation, traced back to a holding entity that Serena Vaughn had established 9 years ago, 2 years before she ever met Eugene. 2 years. She had been building this before she'd even walked into his life. The relationship, the engagement, the careful architecture of trust, all of it constructed around a target she'd identified before he'd ever said her name. Eugene received that particular piece of information on day 6 and sat with it alone for a long time. Not because it broke him, because it confirmed something about his own judgment that he needed to fully reckon with before he was allowed to proceed. On day 8, Minsu intercepted an encrypted message from Serena's secondary device, the one she didn't know they knew about, to the contractor who had managed the cleanup crew sent to Tony's apartment. The message was brief and logistical. She was tying off loose ends, confirming the crew had cleared out of Seoul, asking for confirmation that the secretary problem was resolved. The contractor confirmed it. Serena had no reason to believe otherwise. On day 9, Tony sat up in the facility bed for the first time without assistance, pulled a fresh legal pad from the nightstand drawer that Minsu had stocked without being asked, and began writing out her clinical analysis of the medication log in formal medical language, the kind that would hold up in front of a compliance board, a federal examiner, or a judge. Her handwriting was steady. Her annotations were precise. Eugene read the first 3 pages that evening and didn't say much. He didn't need to. The document was meticulous in the way that only someone who had once staked their entire career on clinical accuracy could produce. Someone who understood that in the right room, with the right audience, a medication log wasn't just evidence. It was a confession. What neither of them had fully resolved yet was how to get Tony into that room. Because Serena already knew her name, and the moment Serena saw Tony walk through the door, she would reach for the one weapon she still believed was loaded. The revoked nursing license, the licensing board hearing, the 6 days of testimony that had ended with a decision that was never actually about Tony's competence. She would use it to discredit everything, and if they hadn't neutralized that angle before the board meeting, It wouldn't matter how clean the evidence was. What Eugene hadn't told Tony yet was what his mother's letter had said about that hearing specifically. About who had made the call to the board. About whose signature was on the complaint that started the whole process 4 years ago. He was going to have to tell her soon. He just needed her to be strong enough to hear it without it destroying her before the fight even began. The meeting invitation went out on a Tuesday morning with the subject line: Quarterly Compliance Review Merger Integration Protocol, 41F Conference Suite, 10:00 a.m. Routine, bureaucratic, the kind of meeting that existed specifically to be tolerated rather than anticipated. Serena's assistant confirmed her attendance without consulting her because these were the meetings Serena always attended. Visible, in control, the future Mrs. Kang presiding over the machinery of an empire she had spent nearly a decade engineering herself into. She dressed for it accordingly. Charcoal, structured, the specific armoring of a woman who moved through corporate spaces like she'd built them herself. She was the third person through the door. The conference suite on the 41st floor ran the full length of the building's east face, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, souls spread out beneath it in the flat gray light of a November morning. The long table seated 22. It was nearly full. Legal teams she didn't recognize. A pair of men in the dark, conservative suits of federal financial examiners, their credentials already placed on the table in front of them with the deliberate visibility of people who wanted to be seen. A forensic accountant she'd crossed paths with once at a regulatory conference 3 years ago, whose presence here made something in her stomach shift almost imperceptibly. Almost. She found her seat, placed her portfolio on the table, looked toward the head of the room where Eugene was standing with his back to the door, looking out at the city. His posture was the same as always, still, contained, gravitationally certain of itself. Then he turned around and pulled out the chair to his immediate right. Tony Brooks sat down in it. The silence lasted less than 2 seconds. Serena's face didn't move. She had trained it too well for that, too many years of managing the space between what she felt and what she displayed. But her eyes went to Tony's face, to the fatting bruise still visible along her cheekbone, to the medical coat she was not wearing, to the legal pad and the organized file folders, and the quiet, absolute steadiness of a woman who had walked into this room knowing exactly what it was going to cost her. Serena looked at Eugene. He looked back at her with the particular expression of a man who had already finished the conversation they were about to have. "Thank you all for coming," he said and sat down. The lead federal examiner opened his folder. The forensic accountant uncapped his pen. The legal teams settled into the specific. Loaded stillness of people who had been thoroughly briefed and were simply waiting for the machinery to begin. Serena set her hands flat on the table, one careful breath in, one out. She reached into her portfolio and found the document she had prepared 3 days ago when the meeting invitation had arrived, and something in its phrasing had made her begin to quietly construct a contingency. She was always constructing contingencies. That was what had kept her untouchable for 9 years. She looked again at Tony, at the woman she had ordered broken and silenced and erased, sitting upright in a chair she had no credentials to occupy, in a room she had no business surviving to enter. And Serena understood, with the cold, clarifying precision of someone who had spent a career reading power dynamics, that she was not here to participate in a compliance review. She was here because Eugene had already decided how this ended and built the entire room around that decision before she'd walked through the door. The contingency she'd prepared was her last real option, and she knew it: the revoked license. Tony's destroyed credibility. The 6-day hearing, the board's decision, the institutional record that said Tony Brooks was not a reliable witness and had never been. It wasn't much, but it was a blade, and Serena Vaughn had one with less. What she didn't know was that Tony had been waiting for her to reach for it. Had been waiting for 11 days, through cracked ribs and antiseptic ceilings and legal pads filled with clinical precision, for exactly this moment. Because the story of how that nursing license was revoked was not the story Serena thought it was. And Tony, finally, had the documents to prove it. Serena moved first, which was exactly what they'd anticipated. She didn't raise her voice. That wasn't her style and never had been. She simply opened her portfolio, removed a single document, and slid it down the table toward the federal examiners with the calm efficiency of someone producing a trump card they'd been holding all morning. "Before we proceed," she said, "I think the room should understand who is being presented as a credible witness in this process." She let a precise pause land. Antoinette Brooks had her nursing license formally revoked 4 years ago following a licensing board determination of gross clinical negligence. She is not a medical professional. She is a disgraced former employee with a documented history of institutional conflict and a clear personal grievance against Kang Group's leadership structure. Another pause. Anything she has annotated, interpreted, or presented as clinical analysis carries exactly the legal weight of a filing clerk's opinion. The room absorbed it. The examiners looked at their folders. One of the legal team members made a note. Serena folded her hands and waited, because this was the moment, the pivot point where Tony's credibility collapsed and everything built on it collapsed with it, and the whole careful architecture Eugene had constructed came apart at the load-bearing wall. Tony opened her first folder. She didn't look at Serena when she spoke. She looked at the examiners because they were the only audience that mattered. "The licensing board determination Ms. Vaughn is referencing was based on a formal complaint filed in March 4 years ago," she said. Her voice was level, not defiant, not emotional. The specific register of a woman who had rehearsed the truth so many times it had become structural. "I have here notarized copies of the hospital's original electronic records, not the versions submitted to the board, but the network-archived originals, time-stamped and retrieved from a backup server that the hospital's IT department failed to scrub before the hearing." She placed the documents in front of the nearest examiner. "On pages 4 through 9, you'll find that 3 patient incident reports cited in the complaint were altered after the fact. The metadata confirms the edits were made from a terminal registered to the hospital's senior administrator, the same administrator whose name appears in the pharmacy receipt trail your team received yesterday." She placed a second document beside the first. "The complaint that started the board hearing was not generated by the hospital," she said. "It was generated externally and routed through the hospital's legal office. The originating email address traces to a private communications account." She looked up for the first time, not at the examiners, at Serena. "Established 9 years ago, under a subsidiary registered in the Cayman Islands that your forensic team has already identified in the pharmaceutical procurement chain." The room was very quiet. Serena's hands were still flat on the table. Her face had not moved, but something behind her eyes had shifted, a microscopic recalibration, the look of a person rapidly rerouting through contingencies and finding each one already blocked. She opened her mouth. Eugene touched the tablet in front of him. The audio came through the conference suite speaker system at a moderate volume, clear, uncompressed, the specific quality of a recording made by a device that cost more than most people's cars. Serena's voice filled the room first, unmistakable even without introduction, speaking to the contractor who had managed the cleanup crew, confirming the apartment, confirming the target, confirming, in language that left no interpretive space whatsoever, that the instruction had been to ensure the secretary did not resurface as a problem. 11 seconds of audio, that was all it took. Eugene stopped the recording. He looked at Serena across the length of the table, across 9 years of constructed proximity, across a dinner table set for 2 on Thursday night while his mother's letter sat in his jacket pocket, across the full accumulated distance of a relationship that had been a transaction from its very first moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Serena looked at the door, then at the examiners, then at the legal teams arranged around the table like walls that had been there long before she'd walked in. Her portfolio was still open in front of her. The single document she'd led with, the one that was supposed to end Tony before she could begin, sat on the table between them, already irrelevant, already historical, already the artifact of a strategy that had run out of road. She picked up her pen, set it down again. For the first time in 9 years, Serena Vaughn had nothing left to reach for. What happened next would determine whether she walked out of this room or was escorted. And from the way the door behind her had not reopened since she'd come through it, she was beginning to understand that one of those outcomes had already been arranged. The door opened at 11:47 a.m. Not the main entrance, the side door, the one that connected the conference suite to the private corridor, the one that Serena had likely noted on her way in as an exit option and had probably been calculating the distance to for the last 4 minutes. 2 federal investigators came through it in the unhurried way of people who already had everything they needed and were simply completing a formality. A third entered from the main door behind her. The legal teams didn't move. The examiners closed their folders with the quiet finality of a chapter ending mid-sentence. Serena stood when they reached her. That was the thing Tony would remember longest, that she stood on her own, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the room with her chin level and her face composed into something that was almost dignity. Almost. The architecture of her control held to the very last moment, which was somehow the most chilling thing about her. The door closed. The room exhaled. Tony looked down at her hands on the table. The legal pad, the folders, the notarized documents that had taken 4 years and a cracked rib and 11 days of quiet, focused fury to assemble, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten it had a name. She felt finished, not empty, finished, the specific completeness of a thing that had been left undone for years and was finally, irrevocably done. Eugene didn't say anything to her immediately. He gathered his documents, spoke quietly to Minsu, exchanged a word with the lead examiner. He moved through the room the way he always did, with that particular gravitational stillness, the room organizing itself around him rather than the other way around. But before he left, he stopped beside her chair. Didn't crouch down, didn't make a moment of it. He simply said, "The licensing board issued a formal reversal this morning. It'll be in your registered mail by Thursday." Tony looked up at him. "My name," she said, not a question, just the weight of it landing. "Your name," he confirmed, and walked out. 3 weeks later. On a Tuesday morning in Mapogu, when the November cold had finally broken into something that felt tentatively like the beginning of something else, Tony stood on a pavement outside a building that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. The sign above the door was simple. Clean lettering on a charcoal background, the kind of design that didn't need to announce itself. Hyrin Community Health Center. Below it, in smaller text, the operating hours and a phone number and the words serving Mapogu and surrounding districts. All patients welcome, all hours. Ella stood beside her, holding her hand, wearing the new shoes. Tony looked at the sign for a long moment. Then she reached into the bag on her shoulder and took out the white coat. It was new, properly new, not the borrowed blazers and reused lanyards of the last 4 years, but something that had been ordered specifically, tailored slightly, folded with the care of an object that meant something. She shook it once and put it on. On the left breast pocket, in navy thread, 2 lines of embroidery. E. Brooks, RN, Director. She smoothed the lapel, looked down at Ella, who was looking up at her with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a 6-year-old forming a conclusion. "You look like you again," Ella said. Tony laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, and squeezed her daughter's hand and pushed open the door. The waiting room inside was clean and bright and smelled like new flooring and possibility. A reception desk, chairs along 2 walls, a mural being finished along the far side by a local artist, birds and botanicals in deep greens and golds, the kind of thing that told patients they had come somewhere that considered them worth the effort of beauty. A young nurse looked up from the desk with a clipboard and an uncertain smile. First day for everyone. "Dr. Brooks," she started. "Just Brooks," Tony said, already moving. "What have we got?" Behind her, somewhere across the city in a building that still had her name on a parking space she would never use again, investigators were still working through the layers of what Serena had built. The pharmaceutical network, the shell companies, the 9 years of careful infiltration. It would take months to fully unravel, maybe longer. And in a top-floor office with brushed gold letters on the door, a man who had once run an empire on emotional distance sat at his desk with a framed photograph he had finally taken out of the drawer, his mother, younger than he'd known her, laughing at something off-camera, and was learning, slowly and without a map, what it meant to let something matter. He had not yet called Tony. He would, but that, as it turned out, was the beginning of an entirely different story.